The chandelier held 300 candles, and every one of them was lit. Mira counted them during the first hour because there was nothing else to do. She stood at the edge of the Haverford ballroom with a glass of ratafia. She had not sipped, her back straight, her chin level, her gown catching the light in ways that made the women nearest her glance, and then looked deliberately away. It was a gown of deep blue silk, French, exquisitely cut, the empire waist, stitched with gold thread so fine it appeared woven rather than sewn, and it had cost more than most of the men in this room earned from their country holdings in a quarter. She knew this because she had approved the bill herself, sitting alone at the writing desk in the Belstowe townhouse, while Auberon was at the House of Lords, and she had not flinched at the figure. A duchess did not flinch at a dressmaker's bill. A duchess wore what was required and stood where she was placed and waited for the evening to do what evenings did. This evening was doing what every evening of the season had done since March. It was ignoring her, not rudely, never rudely, not in the way that could be reported or corrected. The ton was far too practiced for that. It was simply that no one approached. No one included her in the clusters of conversation that formed and reformed like tides across the room. No one caught her eye across the punch table, or complimented her gown, or asked after her health, or inquired whether the Duke's country seat was as fine as everyone said. They moved around her with the fluid precision of people who had been navigating ballrooms since birth, and the space they left around her was exactly wide enough to be unmistakable and exactly narrow enough to be deniable. She was not invisible. That was the cruelty of it. They could all see her perfectly well. She was simply not worth seeing. Across the room, Lady Forsythe laughed at something Lady Pemberton said, and the sound carried like a bell struck once clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear it and understand that wherever Lady Forsythe was laughing, that was where the evening lived. Lady Forsythe was the center of this particular constellation, had been the center of every constellation Mira had encountered since arriving in London 4 months ago, and the constellation had made its position on the Duchess of Belstowe perfectly clear. She will never be one of us. Mira had heard it said once, at the Ashworth musicale, whispered behind a fan, with the confidence of someone who did not care whether she was overheard. She had heard variations of it since. Not quite right for a Duke of Belstowe's wife. Foreign, you know, Romanian, can you imagine? Her father was something diplomatic. One does feel for Belstowe. He might have had anyone. He might have had anyone. That was the phrase that lodged, not because it wounded her pride. Mira's pride had been forged in colder fires than London drawing rooms, but because it was true in the way these women meant it. Auberon Finch, the 6th Duke of Belstowe, possessed one of the oldest titles in England, 40,000 a year, a jaw that could have been carved from Portland stone, and the kind of quiet authority that made other men step back without knowing why. He could have married any daughter of any earl or marquis in the country. He could have had beauty, fortune, connection, and the uncomplicated Englishness that the ton required of its duchesses the way it required candles in its chandeliers. Not because they were necessary, but because their absence would be noticed and resented. Instead, he had married Mira Finch, the daughter of a Romanian diplomat who had served in London for 6 years before his death, a woman who spoke 4 languages and read in 3 more, who had been raised between Bucharest and Vienna and Paris before settling in the small Marylebone house, and who had met the Duke of Belstowe at a lecture on hydraulic engineering at the Royal Institution, a lecture she had attended out of genuine interest, and he had attended because his steward Pem had told him the drainage on the North Estate was becoming unmanageable, and he ought to understand why. They had spoken for 40 minutes after the lecture. He had asked her a question about water tables, and she had answered with a precision that made him forget, for the first time in his adult life, that he was supposed to be performing the role of a duke rather than simply being a man in a room with a woman who knew more than he did about something that mattered. She had not deferred to him. She had not adjusted her vocabulary. She had spoken to him the way she would have spoken to a colleague at her father's table in Vienna, where diplomats and engineers and scholars had gathered every Thursday evening, and where Mira had sat at her father's right hand since the age of 14, listening, absorbing, and occasionally correcting a minister's understanding of trade routes through the Carpathians. He had proposed 11 days later. The Tun had been appalled, and had remained appalled, and Mira had married him anyway, because she had loved him from the 9th minute of that first conversation, when he had said something about limestone permeability that revealed he had actually been listening to the lecture, and not merely attending it for show. And she had thought, here is a man who pays attention to what is real. She had been wrong about that. Or rather, she had been right about limestone, and wrong about everything else. Because Auberon had not paid attention to what was real since the wedding. He had been courteous in the way that dukes were courteous, which was to say impeccably and from a great distance. He had installed her in the Belstowe townhouse with every comfort she could want and none of the things she needed. He had not taken her to a single event on his arm. He had not introduced her to his circle. He had not corrected a single whisper, countered a single slight, or stood beside her in a single room where standing beside her would have cost him something. He attended his obligations in the House of Lords. He dined at his club. He came home late and left early, and when they were in the same room together, which was seldom, he spoke to her with the careful neutrality of a man addressing a guest whose name he could not quite recall. Mira understood what this was. She had grown up in diplomatic households. She recognized the shape of a man who had made a decision he could not undo and had chosen to endure it rather than inhabit it. He had married her in a moment of what? Fascination, perhaps. Curiosity. The novelty of a woman who could discuss hydraulic systems. And then the season had arrived, and the Tun had made its judgment, and Auberon had discovered that the cost of his curiosity was higher than he had anticipated, and he had done what powerful men did when the cost was high. He had stepped back and let someone else pay it. Mira was paying it now, in this ballroom, in this gown, with this glass of ratafia growing warm in her hand. She set the glass down on a passing footman's tray and clasped her hands in front of her. Her posture did not change. Her expression, composed, pleasant, the expression of a woman attending a ball and enjoying herself adequately, did not change. Anka would have recognized the stillness in her shoulders. Anka, who had been her maid since Vienna, who had brushed her hair before the ball tonight in a silence so furious it was nearly audible, who had said only one thing as she fastened the gold clasp at Mira's throat: "You should not go tonight, madam." And Mira had said, "I am the Duchess of Belstowe, Anka. I go where duchesses go." And Anka had pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was swallowing Romanian words that would not have been appropriate in any language. And she had fastened the clasp, and Mira had gone. The orchestra began a new set, a waltz, slow and deliberate, the kind of waltz that required permission and partnership, and the particular public intimacy that the Tun understood as a statement. Couples formed. Lady Forsythe was led to the floor by Lord Ashton, her hand resting on his arm, with the ease of a woman who had never in her life stood at the edge of a room, wondering whether anyone would approach. Other pairs followed. The floor filled. Mira watched from her position near the third window, between a potted fern and a gilt-frame mirror that reflected the room back to itself in warm, candlelit repetition, and she calculated, with the quiet arithmetic she had learned from her father, exactly how many minutes remained before she could leave without the departure itself becoming a topic of discussion. 40 minutes, perhaps 35, if the supper was announced early. She would endure them, as she had endured every other minute of this season, with her chin level and her hands still, and the particular stillness that was not defeat, but simply the recognition that some rooms were not designed to hold you, and the dignified thing was to stand in them without pretending otherwise. It was at this moment, precisely this moment, as the waltz began its first full turn, and the room settled into the pattern of who mattered and who did not, that she felt something shift in the air near the main doors. She did not turn her head. She had trained herself over 4 months not to turn her head every time she felt Auberon enter a room, because the turning had become a kind of small humiliation, the way her body still oriented toward him when her mind knew perfectly well that he would not be coming to her side. But the room turned. She could feel it in the quality of the silence, in the way conversations paused for a half-beat and then resumed with a different texture. Someone had entered, or someone had moved, or something was happening that the ton's collective attention had registered as worth noticing. Mira kept her eyes on the dancers. The sound came toward her, not footsteps. Exactly, the ballroom floor was waxed, and steps were muffled, but the displacement of air and attention that accompanied a man of rank moving through a crowded room with purpose. She could feel people stepping aside. She could feel the questions forming in the minds around her. She could feel Lady Forsythe's gaze, because Lady Forsythe's gaze had a weight to it. The weight of a woman who tracked every movement of consequence in every room she occupied. Mira did not look up until the movement stopped. He was standing in front of her. Auberon Finch, Duke of Belstowe, in his evening black tailcoat and white cravat and knee breeches. His dark hair brushed back from a face that gave nothing away. His jaw set in that particular line that she had once found arresting, and now found merely familiar. He was standing directly in front of her, with his right hand extended palm up, in the unmistakable gesture of a man asking a woman to dance. He was not looking at anyone else in the room. He was looking only at her. The ballroom had not gone silent. Ballrooms never truly went silent. There were too many people and too much music and too many candles hissing in their fixtures, but something had withdrawn from the sound. Some layer of noise and motion had pulled back, and in the space it left. Auberon's hand hung in the air between them like a sentence no one had expected him to say. Mira looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She searched for something there. Mockery, obligation, the performance of a duty he had been advised to perform by some well-meaning friend who had told him the whispers were becoming ungovernable and he ought to be seen with his wife at least once before the season ended. She searched for the careful neutrality she had come to know, the distance that lived in his eyes whenever he looked at her, the remove of a man enduring his own marriage from the safety of politeness. She did not find it. What she found, and she was not certain, because 4 months of silence had taught her to distrust what she saw in his face, was something rawer than she had expected. Something that looked, if she were being reckless with her interpretation, like a man who had crossed a room, not because he had been told to, but because he could not remain on the other side of it for 1 more minute. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, firm, immediate, and he led her to the floor without a word. The couples already dancing adjusted to make space, the way water adjusts around a stone dropped into its center, and the orchestra, whether by coincidence or by the instinct that good musicians develop for the moments that matter, drew the waltz into its most expansive phrase. They danced. Mira had danced with Auberon once before. At their wedding, a formal affair, attended by 400 people who had come to confirm their suspicions about the match and had left with those suspicions thoroughly confirmed. That dance had been correct and brief, and neither of them had spoken during it. This dance was different. This dance was a conversation conducted entirely through the pressure of his hand on her waist and the way he held her gaze, and the small, almost imperceptible way he drew her closer than the waltz strictly required. The room watched. Not with the polite passing attention of a crowd registering a couple on the floor, though with the focused, suspended attention of people witnessing something they would discuss at breakfast tomorrow, and at morning calls the day after, and in letters to their country relatives for weeks to come. The Duchess of Belstowe was dancing with her husband. Or rather, and this was the distinction the ton understood immediately, because the ton always understood the distinctions that mattered, the Duke of Belstowe had crossed an entire ballroom to ask his wife to dance. He had passed Lady Forsythe without acknowledgement. He had passed Lady Trentham and Miss Cartwright and every other woman who had expected, reasonably, to be noticed. He had walked to the place where the ton had put his wife, the edge, the margin, the place near the third window where women who did not matter were permitted to stand. And he had extended his hand, and the gesture had said, with the eloquence that gestures possess when words have failed for months, "She is here because you put her here, and I am here because this is where she is, and I will not pretend otherwise for one more evening." They did not speak. There is nothing to say that the dance was not already saying. She could feel the room watching, not the polite, passing attention of a crowd registering a couple on the floor, but the focused, almost breathless attention of a room that understood it was witnessing something deliberate. A duke dancing with his wife at a ball was unremarkable. A duke who had not been seen with his wife all season, crossing a ballroom to claim her from the edge of the room where the ton had placed her, was a declaration. And Lady Forsythe, standing now at the edge of the dance floor, with Lord Ashton's arm still available and her fan held motionless in her right hand, understood this. Mira could see her. Not directly. Mira's eyes were on Auberon, and his were on hers, and she would not break that exchange for anything. But in the periphery of her vision, in the gilt-frame mirror she had been standing beside moments ago, she could see Lady Forsythe's face. And what she saw there was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was the particular stillness of a woman recalculating. The waltz ended. The couples bowed and curtsied and dispersed. Auberon did not release Mira's hand. "Another," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her all evening. It was nearly the first word he had spoken to her with any warmth in weeks. They danced again, a cotillion this time, then a country dance, then another waltz. Between dances he stood beside her, not across the room, not at the punch table with his associates, not in the card room where the men retreated when they wanted to be absent from their wives without the inconvenience of actually leaving. He stood beside her with his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in the way that husbands touch their wives when they wanted every person in the room to understand that this woman was theirs and the matter was not open for discussion. Other women approached him. Lady Trentham, who had danced with him at the Chelmsford ball in April. Miss Cartwright, whose mother had been angling for a quadrille with the Duke since the season opened. Lady Forsythe herself, who passed near enough to be acknowledged and whose smile was perfectly calibrated for the possibility of an invitation. He danced with none of them. The entire evening, every set, every waltz, every cotillion, he danced only with Mira. And when he was not dancing with her, he was standing beside her, and when he was standing beside her, he was close enough that anyone passing would have to acknowledge them both. And when they acknowledged them both, they were acknowledging something that Ton had spent 4 months trying to deny, that the Duchess of Belstowe existed, and that the Duke of Belstowe knew it. By the fourth dance, the room had reorganized itself. The clusters of conversation that had spent all evening maintaining the careful distance around Mira began slowly to drift closer. Not to her, not yet, but to the space the Duke occupied, which now included her. Lady Pemberton nodded to her as she passed. Mrs. Devereux, who had been one of the quieter members of Lady Forsythe's circle, commented that the music was very fine this evening, and directed the comment unmistakably to Mira. Small adjustments, the ton recalibrating, as it always did, around the reality of power. The supper was announced. Auberon led Mira in on his arm. They sat together. He served her plate. He poured her wine. He spoke to her, not the careful, neutral exchanges of the townhouse, but actual conversation, the kind they had had at the Royal Institution, about a book she had been reading on the management of common lands, and she answered, and he listened. And the table around them watched this happen with the peculiar fascination of people witnessing something they had been told was impossible. When the evening ended, he led her to the carriage himself. He handed her up. He sat beside her, not across from her. Beside her, and the carriage pulled away from the Haverford house and into the London night, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. The streets were quiet. The carriage lanterns threw shifting patterns across the leather seats. Mira could feel the warmth of him next to her, the solid reality of his shoulder near hers, and she kept her hands folded in her lap because she did not trust them. "I have been a coward," he said. She did not reply immediately. The word sat between them. Coward. A word a duke did not use about himself. A word that cost something to say aloud in the dark of a carriage with only your wife to hear it. "Yes," she said, because she would not lie to him. She had never lied to him. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her in the first place, before the season and the whispers and the long retreat into courtesy, and she would not begin now. He exhaled. Not a sigh. Auberon did not sigh, but a release, as though something had been held tightly in his chest for months, and her single word of confirmation had loosened it enough to breathe around. "I told myself it would settle," he said. "That the ton would tire of their objections, that if I did not dignify it with a response, it would pass." "It did not pass," Mira said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. The carriage turned onto Grosvenor Street. "I was not protecting you by staying silent. I was protecting myself from the inconvenience of standing against people whose good opinion I had spent 30 years cultivating." He turned to look at her. In the lantern light, his face had the quality of something carved and then weathered, harder than it had been at their wedding, and more honest. "You deserved better than that. You have deserved better than that from the first day." Mira looked at him. She studied his face with the same careful attention she had given it at the Royal Institution when she had been trying to determine whether this man was real or merely performing intelligence. She had decided then that he was real. She was deciding again. "Now, you crossed the room," she said. "I should have crossed it in March, but you crossed it tonight." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. His grip was the same as it had been on the ballroom floor. Warm, firm, certain. And she thought that this was what the evening had actually been about. Not the dance, not the public statement, not Lady Forsythe's recalculating face. The evening had been about this. A man reaching for his wife's hand in the dark and meaning it. "I will not step back again," he said. "Not from you. Not from this." "I know," she said. And she did. Not because the words were beautiful. Words were easy, even for men who were not given to them, but because she had felt his hand on her waist during the waltz, and there was a quality of intention in it that could not be performed. She had grown up among diplomats. She knew the difference between a gesture made for the room and a gesture made for the person. This had been for her. The carriage arrived at the Belstowe townhouse. He handed her down. They walked inside together, past the footman who held the door, and whose expression did not change, because footmen in ducal households were trained never to show surprise. Though this was, in fact, the first time the Duke and Duchess had arrived home at the same hour and through the same door since the season began. In the entrance hall, beneath the portrait of the fourth Duke that had watched every Belstowe come and go for 70 years, Auberon paused. He was still holding her hand. "The book," he said, "the one about common lands." "Thorne's treatise," Mira said, "on enclosure and its consequences. You were saying at supper that his argument about tenant displacement was incomplete. It is incomplete. He does not account for the secondary effects on local markets when common grazing is removed. The loss is not merely agricultural. It is economic, and it compounds across generations." He looked at her, and there it was, the thing she had seen at the Royal Institution, the thing that had made her love him in 9 minutes. Genuine interest, not performed, not polite, not the dutiful attention of a husband who had been told to try harder. The real, undisguised fascination of a man who had married a woman because she could hold his attention, and who had spent 4 months looking away from the one thing that actually held it. "Tell me," he said. They sat in the drawing room until 3 in the morning, Mira in her blue gown and Auberon in his evening clothes, with candles burning low around them and the fire dying in the grate. And she told him about Thorne's treatise, and he listened, and he argued, and she corrected him. and he conceded the points worth conceding and held the ones worth holding. And by the time the last candle guttered, they had covered enclosure, drainage, tenant law, the administration of the Belstowe North Estate, in the particular way that Mira's father had managed the diplomatic household in Vienna. Not because any of these topics were romantic, but because this was what their marriage was. Two minds. The same room. Actual attention. Anka, who had been waiting up because Anka always waited up, heard the sound of conversation drifting from beneath the drawing-room door, and did something she had not done in 4 months. She smiled the following morning. The first caller at the Belstowe townhouse was Mrs. Devereux. She stayed for 20 minutes and complimented Mira's taste in furnishings. The second caller was Lady Pemberton, who stayed for 30 minutes and discussed a charity concert she was organizing, and wondered whether the Duchess might lend her patronage. The third caller was Lady Trentham, who stayed for an hour and left with a genuine liking for a woman she had been told, by people she now suspected of poor judgment, was not worth knowing. Lady Forsythe did not call that day, or the next, or the next. Auberon, meanwhile, did something he had not done all season. He canceled his club engagements. He sent word to White's that he would not be dining there for the foreseeable future, and the note was received with the particular silence that falls over a gentleman's club when one of its most prominent members announces without explanation that he has other priorities. He took Mira to the park in his open carriage, in daylight where the Ton could see them. He drove the carriage himself, not his coachman, himself, and Mira sat beside him in a pelisse of cream wool and a bonnet trimmed with blue ribbon, and they moved through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour with the unhurried ease of a couple who had been doing this all season, which was precisely the impression Auberon intended to create. He brought her to the theater and sat beside her in the Belstowe box and introduced her to every acquaintance who approached during the interval, and he did not say "my wife" in the way that men said it when they were performing obligation. He said it the way men said it when they meant it, with an inflection that contained possession and pride, and the quiet suggestion that the acquaintance in question should consider themselves fortunate to be making her acquaintance. When they attended the Cavendish soirée 3 days after the Haverford ball, he arrived with her on his arm, and he did not leave her side, and when Lord Devonish made a comment about the Duchess's continental perspective that carried a barb wrapped in courtesy, Auberon said in a voice that did not rise but did not need to, "My wife's perspective, continental or otherwise, is the most valuable one in any room I have entered this season, and I include the House of Lords in that assessment." Lord Devonish did not make another comment of the kind. The season turned. June arrived, and with it the slow dispersal of the Ton to their country estates, the annual retreat from London heat and London gossip. The Belstowe household returned to Belstowe Park, the great house in Derbyshire, where Mira had spent exactly 4 weeks after the wedding, before Auberon had brought her to London for the season, and the silence had begun. It was a different house now, or rather, it was the same house with different people in it, or perhaps the same people finally permitted to be who they actually were. Auberon walked the grounds with her. He showed her the north fields where the drainage had failed, and the tenants' cottages where the roofs needed mending, and the stretch of common land along the river where the village children had grazed their families' goats for generations, and which a previous steward had proposed enclosing for timber revenue. Mira walked the common land for an hour, spoke with 3 tenant families, consulted a survey map from 1794 that she found in the estate library, and told Auberon that the common land should remain common. He agreed. He would have agreed even if her reasoning had been less compelling, because he had married a woman whose judgment he trusted, and trusting it selectively, on hydraulics but not on people, on drainage but not on dignity, had been the central failure of his first 4 months as a husband, and he did not intend to repeat it. He introduced her to the steward Pem. Properly this time, not as a formality, but as the woman who would be overseeing the estate through Pem's offices, because she understood drainage and common lands and tenant economics better than he did, and there was no purpose in pretending otherwise. Pem, who was a careful man and not given to rapid reassessment, observed the Duchess for a week, and then quietly began routing his morning reports through her study, instead of the Duke's. Mrs. Gatto. Garth, the housekeeper, had been routing them through Mira's study since March. Mrs. Garth had known, since the day Mira arrived at Belstowe Park, what the Duke and the ton had taken 4 months to see. Some women you recognized immediately. You simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. 3 years passed. Mira's Romanian was heard in the nursery now, soft, musical, threaded through the lullabies she sang to their son, who had his father's jaw and his mother's dark eyes and a disposition that the household already recognized as formidable. Auberon had learned fragments of Romanian himself, not through any formal study, but through the slow absorption that comes from living beside a person whose language shapes the rhythm of the house. He mispronounced most of it. Mira corrected him with the same patience she applied to his understanding of tenant law, which was to say, she corrected him completely and without apology, and he accepted the correction because he had married a woman who did not soften the truth, and he had learned eventually that this was the thing he valued most. The Belstowe estate prospered. 1. The north drainage, which had been Pem's original concern, had been resolved through a scheme Mira designed, based on principles she had discussed at the Royal Institution lecture, where they met. A fact Auberon mentioned to visitors so frequently that Pem had taken to clearing his throat whenever the subject arose, which only encouraged Auberon to tell the story again. In London, the memory of that Haverford ball had settled into the ton's collective understanding, not as a scandal, but as a correction. The Duke of Belstowe danced with his wife. He danced only with his wife. He had been doing so at every ball for 3 seasons, and he showed no indication of stopping. The Duchess of Belstowe, who spoke 4 languages and understood land management, and had once quietly corrected the Home Secretary on a point of Romanian diplomatic history at a dinner party, was received everywhere with the respect that had been withheld from her, and that she had never demanded, and that had come to her as these things sometimes do, through the slow recognition that worth does not require permission. Lady Forsythe called on Mira in the 4th year. It was a Tuesday in May, the season newly begun, the Belstowe townhouse bright with morning light, and the scent of the hyacinths Mira had planted in the window boxes because they reminded her of her father's garden in Marylebone. Lady Forsythe arrived in a carriage that cost a great deal and was shown into the drawing room by a footman who did not blink. Mira received her with perfect courtesy. She offered tea. She inquired after Lady Forsythe's health and her daughter's debut and the progress of the charity hospital Lady Forsythe now patronized. She did not mention the Haverford ball. She did not mention the whispers, or the exclusion, or the 4 months of standing at the edge of rooms while the ton decided she was not worth knowing. She did not mention any of it because none of it required mentioning. Lady Forsythe knew. Mira knew. The drawing room, with its hyacinths and its morning light and its quiet evidence of a household that was thriving, said everything that needed to be said. Lady Forsythe stayed for 45 minutes. When she left, she paused at the door and said, "Your Grace, I wonder if you might consider lending your name to the hospital benefit next month. Your support would be most welcome." "I should be delighted," Mira said, and that was all. No reckoning, no confrontation, no scene in which the woman who had whispered, "She will never be one of us," was made to kneel or apologize or suffer. Just a drawing room and a cup of tea and the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who had never needed to be one of them, because she had always, from the very first evening, from the very first whisper, from the very first moment she stood at the edge of a ballroom in a gown of deep blue silk and counted the candles because there was nothing else to do, been exactly and only and entirely herself. In the nursery that evening, Mira sang to her son in Romanian while the last light came through the tall windows, and Auberon sat in the chair by the door, not because he needed to be there, but because there was nowhere else in any room in any house in England that he would rather be. Anka, passing in the corridor, heard the singing and the silence that surrounded it, and did not pause. She did not need to. She had known since Vienna. Some things simply took the rest of the world longer to understand. They arrive here, like a hand extended across a crowded room, not asking permission, not explaining itself, simply certain of where it is going.